Hi there, my name's Richard Turl. I'm the pastor of Mickfield Evangelical Church, and in my last video I promised that I would give an Easter message on Easter Day. So here we are, Easter Day, and this is my Easter message to people out there in the community. And I've got to level with you. That's a phrase that Boris Johnson's used a number of times recently. I've got to level with the British public, he said, hasn't he? What he means by that is that he wants to put across the reality. This is what the reality of the situation is. And I want to level with you today about Christianity, about Jesus and the Bible, and say there are lots of things that we can think about, but actually when it comes to Jesus, the Bible, Christianity, when it comes to Easter, everything hangs on this: that Jesus died and that he rose again. That's the claim of Christians, that Christians have been worshipping Jesus for 2,000 years, millions of people, and they all believe that Jesus died and rose again, that he came back to life physically, came back to life from the grave, and everything hangs on this. One of the early Christian leaders, Paul, said exactly that. If that's not true, if Jesus didn't really come back to life, then our faith is futile, it's a waste, we're believing in vain, our message is false, and it's a complete waste of our time. But for 2,000 years and for millions of Christians all around the world, we do believe, with reasons, that Jesus died and rose again. And what I want to do today is present to you what I'd like to call the 6 E's of evidence that show us that Jesus really did rise from the grave. So here they are, the 6 E's of evidence. The first one is existence. I know some people sometimes think, well, maybe Jesus just didn't exist. Maybe Jesus is just a fairy tale. And that's one very easy way of sidelining his death and resurrection, isn't it? To just say he didn't die and rise again at all. He doesn't exist. But there's a whole ton of evidence, historical evidence, that Jesus of Nazareth absolutely existed. Historians don't really debate his existence. What they debate more is his significance and the things that he said. But historians, whether they're ancient or modern, agree that Jesus existed. The second E of evidence is execution. Sometimes it's claimed that, well, maybe Jesus fainted on the cross and then he was put in the tomb and the cold tomb revived him, or some other idea like that, the swoon theory as it's sometimes been called. But this can't be right, because Jesus was executed by expert executioners. The Romans were good at many things, particularly killing people. And Jesus suffered terribly, didn't he? The historical record shows us that Jesus was definitely dead. He was beaten, and then he was scourged or flogged. That's the thing that was depicted in the film the Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. It's a brutal punishment, and people died from that alone. But that's not it, because then Jesus had to carry the crossbeam to the place of execution wearing this crown of thorns. He was then crucified, which is an execution process. The Romans were particularly good at crucifying people. A spear is shoved into his side and blood and water pours out, sure medical evidence that his body is dead. Jesus is dead on the cross. He's declared to be dead by a professional executioner. And then he's taken down and wrapped in up to around 100 pounds of spices and linen, put into a cold tomb with obviously no medical care, because he really was definitely dead. So you see, Jesus is very real, exists, and Jesus was definitely dead. He was executed. So what's the third E of evidence? Well, the third E of evidence is the empty tomb. Jesus leaves behind an empty tomb. If you look at all the other religious leaders and other leaders throughout history, their graves, their tombs are not empty. But Jesus leaves us with an empty tomb, an empty cross and an empty tomb. Now bear in mind that as Jesus' body was placed in the tomb, it was shut up, it was sealed, a great stone was rolled across the entrance, soldiers were placed on guard. Some people have claimed that maybe people got the wrong tomb and found another tomb that was empty. But that goes in the face of all of the evidence. That would mean that so many people, the women who first met the risen Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, the man who it was his tomb, that all these people, the soldiers, the authorities, all got it wrong. Some people have claimed that the body was stolen. Well, if it was, why did the grave robbers leave the most valuable thing of all, the linen that was wrapped around Jesus' body? And how would they even have been able to rob the body, to get past the seal, the stone, the guards? The same problem is there if we think that the disciples somehow stole Jesus' body. They didn't have the power or the ability to do that. They didn't have the inclination or the desire to do that. They didn't fully believe in Jesus' resurrection at that point. They were like frightened rabbits hiding away from the authorities. So there's an empty tomb. Jesus is very real, definitely dead. He leaves behind an empty tomb, and that leads to the fourth E of evidence, eyewitnesses. Because after that, what we see is that many, many people claim to have met the risen Jesus. I studied A-level history, and in one of my classes, I remember the class know-it-all was chatting away about some event in history, going on and on about this strike, miners' strike or something like that. And eventually this person stopped speaking, and the teacher said, "I know, I was there." And the thing that the student had been talking about, the very particular aspect of it, this guy was that person that she was talking about. "I know, I was there." And that's what many people could have said of Jesus. "I know, I was there." There were a whole load of eyewitnesses who met with the risen Jesus, ate with him. Sometimes he met one person, two, a small group, a larger group. Once 500 people at one time, skeptical people who didn't believe it all, met this risen Jesus. They met him. They saw him. Now people might say, oh, it was a hallucination. Well, mass hallucination doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. The idea that all of these people had hallucinations at the same time, it just doesn't go with the science and the evidence. It's interesting that the first eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection were women. Now, in that historical context, the testimony of women was not considered to be on the same level as that of men. Now we're not condoning that at all. But isn't it interesting, if you'd wanted to make up the story in that cultural context, would you have really chosen women to be the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection? No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't have done that. But the first witnesses to the resurrection were women, Mary Magdalene and some of the other women. These people, they weren't stupid, they weren't gullible. That's chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis has called it. To look back on those people and say, oh, they must have been stupid. Maybe they just always thought that people rose from the dead. They didn't. They knew full well that dead men don't rise. And yet they were convinced that they'd seen the risen Jesus. They saw what they saw. They said what they saw. And for many of them, it cost them their lives. They believed in this. Now, many people might die for a lie, but why would you die for a lie if you knew it was a lie? If you knew it was all made up and it was all one big bit of a joke, bit of a story, then why go to your death? Why not at the end say, actually, this whole thing about Jesus is all made up? No, these people were convinced. They saw what they saw, they said what they saw, and for many of them it cost them their lives. The fifth E of evidence is the early spread of this message. It's not the case that some stuff happened and then some time went on and these things gradually developed and stories were developed over time. No, right from day one, the Christians proclaimed the message that Jesus had died and that they were witnesses that this man was alive, that he'd risen from the grave. Now, how do you explain how all of these frightened rabbits, as they were, scared of the authorities, suddenly became bold proclaimers of this new message? The only plausible explanation is that they had in fact met this risen Jesus, who's very real, who definitely died, who's left an empty tomb and a whole load of eyewitnesses to prove that he really was alive. And then finally there's the example of Paul. Paul was one of the early Christian leaders, but before all of that, Paul was the Dawkins of his day. He was worse than Dawkins. Paul hated Christians, and he went around trying to arrest them. That was his job, that was his role, to go and arrest and lock up men and women and children, Christian believers. But all of that changed. And all of a sudden, Paul, who is this great enemy of Christianity, becomes one of its greatest proponents. He wrote much of the New Testament part of the Bible. Paul was this great early Christian leader, planter of many church congregations, and great preacher of the Christian message. And central to that he had met the risen Jesus, and that's why the Dawkins of his day became the Apostle Paul, one of the great leaders of the early church. So there's 6 E's of evidence that Jesus really was alive. He really was real. He really died. And he really did rise from the grave, came back to life physically. Now, many people have looked into this. All kinds of people have looked into it. My own wife looked into the evidence of this because she just had to look at it. Dead men don't rise. This doesn't happen. And what is this all about? She read and researched and spoke to experts about it until she was intellectually satisfied that Jesus really had risen from the grave. One author who's looked into all of the evidence, considered this from a skeptical point of view, said that in the end he was just worn down by the stubbornness of the facts. Another has said that he was ambushed by the evidence. He came in skeptical, but when he looked at it all, he was ambushed by the evidence. Now, this is a very brief summary of the evidence for the resurrection. If you'd like to read more, there's all kinds of things out there. I particularly recommend, just for a basic introduction, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Many folks will have gathered to watch the Queen's speech recently. The Queen, she's not done it very often, has she? But this was a special speech, not a Christmas speech, of course, but a speech about the coronavirus situation. And she spoke very well to the nation. Well, what I'd encourage you to do is consider, of course, the words of the Queen, but consider the words of Jesus, who claims to be the risen King. And this is what he says about this whole idea of life beyond the grave. In John chapter 11, verse 25, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? That's what Jesus says. He has risen. He has conquered the grave. And what he claims is that those who believe in him can also have life beyond the grave. And he asks that question. Do you believe? Do you believe in me? Do you trust in Jesus? Those are the words of the King to you on this Easter day.